Hey, the Wachusett Chess Club last night started a new tournament. It, as usual, is a 5-round tournament, and I was on board 1 with the white pieces against Dave Thomas. He's rated 1700 and change, and my rating going into this game was about 2130. I played d4, he played c5. c5 is a move that can be played in d-pawn openings with a lot of flexibility, I think. It's often the case that white doesn't want to just take on c5 because it gives up a center pawn, and it's not very difficult in many cases for black to regain that pawn. So I played d5, and after d6, c4, knight f6, knight c3, you may recognize this pawn structure as being one that you can get in a King's Indian defense or a Benoni, as we'll see in a sec. g6, e4, taking more space in the center, bishop g7, bishop e2, castle. Okay, and with the structure as it is now, as I've said in the past, you look for pawn breaks to the left and right of the locked portion of the central pawn structure. In this case, the locked portion is on the C and D files, so if black wants to break, he's going to play e6 or b5, and if white wants to break, he's going to play e5 or b4. And after black's eventual e6, as we'll see in the game, we get into a position that resembles the type of position you'd get in an opening called the Benoni. But what I sometimes do against players I am higher rated than is play aggressively in what amounts to the chess equivalent of what in poker is called a semi-bluff. In poker, sometimes you bluff in situations in which you have a chance to win anyway, and the idea is either your opponent will believe your bluff, in which case you win right away, or he'll call your bluff and you'll still win some percentage of the time when that happens. So the equivalent of that in chess is sometimes you can make a move that's very aggressive, and if your opponent kind of believes that it's a sound move, you may end up with an overwhelmingly strategically advantageous position. But even if he doesn't believe you, he may not find the right counter to your move. So I played f4, very aggressive, and I suspected during the game that this was not optimal, although I can't really say for sure because I don't know all that much about opening theory. e6, and now knight f3, and my idea is I'm establishing a gigantic white pawn center, and if black doesn't deal with that effectively, eventually I'm going to play e5. I'm going to have an overwhelming space advantage, and should be able to, as a result, maneuver my pieces more effectively than black and win some kind of material. Black traded on d5, which is good, and after c takes d5, this pawn structure is one that you normally get out of an opening called the Benoni. Bishop g4, good idea for black. I think it's Yasser Seirawan who says that black in the Benoni can't count himself as okay until he trades 2 pairs of minor pieces. So this is black's first minor piece trade, and it's for that reason a good idea. I played h3, bishop f3, and a6 from black. Okay, so white's been very aggressive, and if black's going to hold white responsible for that, he has to do it by, I guess, using tactics to his advantage before white can consolidate and build up his pieces behind his pawn center. And there are all sorts of moves to consider here. Queen a5 is one of them, although it's not so much a consideration anymore now that the light-squared bishop is guarding e4, although earlier in the game it was, because it would pin the knight on c3, thereby making the e4 pawn vulnerable. Another consideration is either with or without queen a5, some kind of sacrifice by the knight on d5 or e4, with the idea that it reveals the bishop's attack on c3, and that may lead to some favorable tactics for black. You see that a lot in the Benoni. But with this particular setup, the move I was worried about was knight h5. And this basically says, okay, white's been very aggressive, and the drawback of that is that there are serious dark square weaknesses on the king side. So black just wants to sink a knight into g3 and maybe trade it off for a white minor piece, which would achieve another piece trade, which is a good idea typically for black in the Benoni. And if white doesn't respond correctly, black may also hit him with this queen h4 check, which can't be responded to by anything except an undesirable king move. And it's natural for white to play bishop takes h5 here, getting rid of that pesky knight, but black will respond with queen h4 check, and then after king f1, some capture on h5, probably g takes h5. And there's at least a concern here about the safety of the white king. In fact, well, I was going to say maybe black can play bishop d4 as an in-between move, threatening mate on f2, but I think here white, it was this move. White may have g3, which may force a queen trade, because if queen takes g3, queen f3 guards the f2 square, threatens the black queen, and if black trades, white holds on to his extra piece. So black had to look for something like this as a way to say to white, you've been too aggressive and I'm going to hold you responsible for that. But instead, black played a6, and this is a normal kind of move in the Benoni. As I mentioned earlier, b5 is a common way for black to play, to gain space on the queen side and to eventually develop some threats because of these mobile pawns on b5 and c5. And it's very common for white to respond to a6 with a4. In fact, it's almost automatic for experienced players. But I was so concerned about this knight h5 move that I was looking for something to do in response to a6 other than play a4. And what I was looking at is castle kingside, b5, and then I thought e5. And the idea here is that there are some tactics that could be very bad for black. For example, d takes e5, f takes e5, and now as soon as white plays d6, the rook on a8 is going to be hit by the bishop on f3. But after e5, black can just play knight f to d7, and is now threatening to win a pawn on e5. I have no, at least right now, I have no d6 revealed attack on the rook on a8. I've got to deal with the fact that black has successfully expanded on the queen side with b5. Things didn't look very good for me here. So even though I wanted to prevent knight h5, I couldn't justify not playing a4, so I played it. And here again, knight h5 is the idea, but black played knight takes e4 instead. And I've got to give Dave credit here, because I think he understood that in this position black has to, there's an urgency for black to do something to show white's play to be too aggressive. Because if white gets to castle kingside and develop his pieces and bring his rooks in behind the center, eventually there's just going to be e5 and white's going to have a clear advantage. But the way he chose to try to take advantage of white's play was not good. He played knight takes e4, and now if bishop takes e4, there's bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3, rook e8, and black is going to recover a piece with f5. But unfortunately for black, white can play knight takes e4 here, as I did in the game, and after his rook e8, castle kingside. I think instead of rook e8, maybe bishop d4, stopping castling kingside is a little bit better. But either way, white ends up a piece. Rook e8, castle kingside, and since white is up a piece and has active pieces and extra space, things fall apart pretty quickly here for black. Dave played bishop d4 check, but after king h2, it turns out that's just a check, right? And then after f5, there's knight g5 coming into the e6 square. Dave made the interesting choice to sacrifice an exchange here with queen f6, knight e6, at which point white just wants to trade off the powerful bishop on d4, and rook takes e6. But this, after d takes e6, queen takes e6, turns out to have unleashed the bishop's attack on b7. So bishop takes b7, rook a7, and now after queen f3, white is threatening bishop d5, pinning the black queen to the king, which would win the game on the spot. So black has to deal with this. He chose to deal with it by playing queen d7, which comes with its own threat to win the bishop on b7. But the move bishop d5 check comes with tempo and is a nice improving move for that bishop. And after king h8, bishop d2 develops the last white minor piece. And it seems to hang the pawn on b2, pardon me. And black did take that, but he's not really to be blamed for taking it because there's not much else black can do here. I played rook a to b1, skewering the bishop and the knight on b8. And it turns out there's no way to save the piece. Looks like black can save the bishop on b2 with queen g7, but then it turns out that rook takes b2 can be played anyway, because if queen takes b2, bishop c3 check wins the queen. So in this position, after rook a to b1, Dave resigned. Alright, so that was a successful first game. We've got 4 rounds of the tournament left, 1 per week, every Wednesday night. And I'll be back next week with my second round game. Thanks a lot.